It was a freezing night in New York, the kind of cold that bites at your skin and makes every breath visible in the air. As Barron Trump drove past the corner of 34th Street and 7th Avenue, something caught his eye, forcing him to look twice. In the dim light of a back alley, a frail woman sat hunched over, wrapped in layers of tattered blankets. He asked his driver to stop, the low hum of the engine breaking the eerie silence. How often do we pass by people without really seeing them? He thought. What he didn't know was that this moment would forever change his outlook on life. Barron stepped out of the car, his polished leather shoes crunching against the thin layer of snow on the ground. As he approached, the sharp mixed scent of cold air and urban decay grew stronger, but it was a helpless look on the woman's face that struck him the most. Then her weary eyes met his, and a flicker of recognition crossed her worn-out features. Helen, his voice wavered, his heart pounding as memories flooded back. It was almost impossible to believe that the frail figure before him was the same nanny who had once comforted him through countless childhood nightmares. Helen's trembling hands clutched a dirty blanket as she looked up at him with confusion and disbelief. Barron, her voice was weak, almost lost in the icy breeze, but the emotion in it was unmistakable. In that moment, vivid images of the times she had cared for him resurfaced in his mind. Helen had been his rock during uncertain times, a source of patience and unwavering love. Now, seeing her in this state left him reeling. How had someone so strong, so significant ended up here? The wind picked up, making her pull the blanket tighter around herself as she lowered her gaze, embarrassed. "I didn't want you to see me like this," she murmured. Barron's chest tightened, guilt and concern colliding within him. He didn't know the full story yet, but one thing was clear. He couldn't leave her like this. "Come with me," he said softly, holding back the overwhelming emotion threatening to spill over. And so, the journey to uncover her story began. Inside the car, warmed by the steady hum of the heater, Helen finally began to relax, her fingers still trembling from the cold as she wrapped them around the cup of coffee Barron had handed her. The silence between them was heavy, but the pain in her tired eyes spoke volumes. "I lost everything," she whispered, her voice nearly drowned out by the car's engine. Barron studied her face, his mind racing with one question. How could someone who had once been so essential in his life end up like this? Helen started to share her story, her words hesitant at first, but soon pouring out like a flood she couldn't contain. "After I left your home, I tried to start over. I found a tiny apartment in Los Angeles, took cleaning jobs, and was saving enough to dream about a peaceful future." Her voice cracked as she relived the memories. But then came the fire. One night, everything I had turned to ash. Her words were raw, and Barron felt the weight of her pain as if it were his own. He listened intently, his heart breaking with every detail she revealed. Helen described how, without insurance or support, the streets became her only option. At first, you tell yourself you'll find a way out, but then one door after another slams shut and you start to lose faith, she said, her gaze fixed on her trembling hands in her lap. The worst part isn't the cold or the hunger. It's the loneliness, the silence of being invisible. Her confession left Barron grappling with emotions he couldn't quite articulate. "You can't imagine what it's like to live without hope, Barron," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of shame and sorrow. He swallowed hard, guilt and helplessness welling up inside him. As the car approached the hotel he had arranged for her, Barron couldn't shake the thought that he had failed to see the struggles of someone who had once been his anchor. The city outside seemed asleep, but Barron's mind raced with a growing determination to understand the depth of her pain. Inside the warmth of the hotel room, Helen hesitated, her eyes scanning the elegant decor as if she didn't belong. The contrast between this space and the harsh streets she had called home for years was overwhelming. Barron gently guided her to a chair and handed her a plate of food. "Please eat something," he urged, his tone kind but firm. Helen sat, her hands trembling as she picked up the fork. "You don't have to do this for me," she said softly, her voice laced with both gratitude and shame. But I do, Barron replied. You've done more for me than I ever realized. As the steam from her meal curled in the air, Helen began to open up more about her life on the streets. Skid Row isn't a place you live. It's a place you survive, she said, her words heavy with emotion. Every day is a battle. You fight for food, for safety, even for a piece of sidewalk to call your own. Her voice faltered, and she looked down at her hands. You start to feel like you're not even human anymore, just a shadow people avoid. Barron listened intently, his chest tightening with every word. She described the moments that broke her spirit. The night spent in the freezing cold, the people who looked right through her, and the constant fear of what each night might bring. Danger. The worst part, she said, her voice cracking, is when you realize no one is coming to help. You're just forgotten. Barron's heart ached as he watched the tears well up in her eyes. He wanted to tell her she wasn't forgotten, but the words felt inadequate. All he could do was reach across the table and squeeze her hand, offering the silent comfort of his presence. Helen looked at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. I've lived so long in survival mode that I don't even know how to hope anymore, she confessed. Barron nodded, his resolve solidifying. Then let's take it one step at a time, he said gently. Hope can wait. For now, we'll focus on getting you back on your feet. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, but the uncertainty in her eyes lingered. Barron knew this was just the beginning, and there was much more to uncover. Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of the hotel room, casting a warm glow over Helen as she stirred awake. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the softness of the bed beneath her, a stark contrast to the cold, unyielding pavement she had called home for so long. Barron was already waiting for her in the small sitting area, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. Good morning, Helen, he said with a gentle smile. Today, we take the first steps toward a fresh start. She nodded, though doubt still flickered in her tired eyes. As they sat together over breakfast, Barron asked her a question that caught her off guard. If you could do anything, Helen, what would it be? Her fork paused midair, and she stared at him for a moment before shaking her head. I don't know, Barron. When you've spent years just trying to survive, dreaming feels like a luxury you can't afford. Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic, and it struck Barron deeply. For him, dreams were second nature. For her, they had become a distant memory. Helen began to share more about the fire that had turned her life upside down. It all happened so fast. One moment, I was asleep. The next, I woke up to the smell of smoke and the sound of everything I owned being destroyed. Her voice trembled, and her hands clenched into fists as she relived the memory. I lost everything in one night. My home, my belongings, and any sense of stability I had. Barron could only imagine the fear and helplessness she must have felt, and his heart ached at the thought. Helen, Barron said softly, placing a reassuring hand on hers, we can't change the past, but we can change what comes next. She looked at him, her eyes brimming with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. I just don't want to disappoint you, she whispered. He shook his head firmly. You couldn't. The only disappointment would be if I didn't try to help you. His words lingered in the air as they finished their meal, both silently contemplating the road ahead. Barron couldn't shake the lingering question that had haunted him since finding Helen. How had someone who once meant so much been cast aside so easily? While Helen rested at the hotel, he decided to uncover the truth. A call to his mother's assistant shed light on a reality he wasn't prepared for. It was a practical decision, the assistant said almost dismissively. Your mother didn't feel she needed Helen anymore. The cold detachment in those words struck Barron like a blow, igniting a mix of frustration and guilt. Determined to get answers, Barron confronted his mother that evening in her opulent Manhattan penthouse. Sitting across from her in a room filled with luxury, he laid it out plainly. Helen isn't just someone we hired. She was family, and she gave everything to take care of me. His mother, sipping tea with practiced composure, avoided his gaze. "Circumstances change," she replied curtly. "We had to move on." Barron's voice rose slightly. "Move on? She lost everything, and you didn't even look back." Meanwhile, Helen had never spoken about the circumstances of her dismissal. Whether out of pride or a desire to shield Barron from the truth, she had kept that chapter of her life locked away. But now that he knew, Barron's perspective shifted completely. He realized that while he couldn't undo the harm done, he could take responsibility for the future. For the first time, he began to see the divide between his life of privilege and the struggles of those who had quietly sacrificed for him. That night, as Helen sat by the window of her hotel room, watching the lights of the city, Barron returned with a mix of determination and sorrow etched on his face. "Helen," he began, sitting across from her, "why didn't you ever tell me what happened after you left?" Her eyes softened, and she let out a heavy sigh. "You were just a boy, Barron. It wasn't your burden to carry." Her selflessness only deepened his resolve. He couldn't change her past, but he was determined to ensure her future was filled with hope. The next morning, Barron woke up with a clear plan. He wasn't just going to offer Helen a temporary reprieve. He wanted to rebuild her life, step by step. With a few calls, he assembled a team: doctors to assess her health, lawyers to explore any reparations she might be owed, and social workers to help her navigate the road to stability. Helen, sitting in the hotel's lounge, watched the flurry of activity with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Barron met her gaze with quiet conviction. "Because you never gave up on me," he said. "And now I won't give up on you." "Why are you doing all this for me, Barron?" Helen asked, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "Because you did so much for me when I couldn't do anything for myself," he replied. The doctors were straightforward. Years of hardship had left their mark. Helen suffered from respiratory issues, malnutrition, and untreated injuries that had worsened over time. Yet, there was hope. With proper care, she can recover, one doctor assured. Hearing this, Helen's shoulders slumped with relief, though doubt still lingered in her eyes. "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured. Barron leaned forward, his tone steady and firm. "Helen, you're not a burden. You're a reminder of what it means to never give up." As Helen began her journey to recovery, her resilience started to inspire everyone around her. Nurses spoke of her quiet strength. Lawyers became deeply invested in her case, and even Barron felt himself changing, his perspective on privilege and responsibility evolving with every step. "Helen," he said one afternoon, "you're showing people what it means to fight through the impossible." She looked at him, her lips curving into a soft smile. "I didn't think I had any fight left," she admitted. "Maybe I do." Yet, beneath the surface, Helen carried a secret she hadn't yet revealed. "Barron," she said hesitantly one evening, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you. It's about something that happened a long time ago." Her voice faltered, and she shook her head. "Not now, but soon." Intrigued but respectful, Barron nodded. Whatever it was, he would wait. For now, his focus remained on helping Helen reclaim her dignity one day at a time. Helen's progress was remarkable, but Barron could sense that something still weighed heavily on her heart. One crisp afternoon, they sat together on a bench in Central Park, the autumn leaves falling gently around them. Helen stared at the horizon, lost in thought. "Barron, I think it's time I tell you what I've been holding back," she said softly. Her hands fidgeted in her lap as she gathered the courage to continue. "There's something I never told anyone, not even your family." Her voice trembled as she recounted a moment from years ago. "You were just a little boy, no older than 5. There was an accident in the house, something no one else noticed at the time. A gas leak. I remember the smell and the fear that ran through me when I realized what could happen." She paused, her breathing uneven. "You were in the living room, playing near the stove. I didn't even think. I ran, grabbed you, and got us both out before the fire started." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "It wasn't just a fire that changed me, Baron. It was a realization that I'd risk everything for you without a second thought. Baron was stunned, the weight of her story settling over him like a heavy blanket of mixed emotions. He tried to speak, but the lump in his throat wouldn't let him. Helen continued, her voice growing steadier. I didn't want you to grow up feeling like you owed me anything. That's why I never said a word. You were a child, and none of it was your fault. She looked down, her voice softening. But I've carried that memory with me every day since. Helen, Baron finally said, his voice thick with emotion, you didn't just save my life. You shaped it. Everything I've become is because of the love and care you gave me. She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. And now you've saved me, Baron, she said with a faint smile. But for Baron, her words only deepened his resolve. He wasn't done yet. Helen deserved more than gratitude. She deserved a legacy. Weeks later, the grand ballroom of a Manhattan hotel buzzed with anticipation. The room was filled with journalists, philanthropists, and advocates, all gathered for an event Baron had poured his heart into. At the center of it all was Helen, standing beside him in an elegant navy dress, her posture proud yet humble. As the spotlight fell on her, she took a deep breath and stepped forward to the microphone. The room fell silent as her voice, steady but emotional, filled the space. For a long time, I thought my story was over, she began. But today, I know it was just the beginning. Helen shared her journey, speaking about the struggles she had faced and the small moments of hope that had kept her going. The streets are a place where you lose everything, your home, your health, even your sense of self. But sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to remind you of who you are. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. I'm standing here today not because of what I lost, but because someone chose to see me when the world didn't. Her words hung in the air, raw and powerful, resonating deeply with everyone present. The highlight of the evening came when Baron stepped forward to announce the creation of a foundation in Helen's honor. The Helen's Hope Foundation will provide housing, health care, and opportunities for those who, like Helen, have been overlooked and forgotten. The applause was thunderous, but Helen's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. This isn't just about me, she said, her voice breaking. It's about proving that compassion can change lives, not just one, but many. As the event came to a close, Helen and Baron stood together, watching the crowd disperse. She turned to him, her expression soft but resolute. You didn't just change my life, Baron. You reminded me of the person I was always meant to be. He smiled, his heart full. And you've reminded me of what really matters, he replied. As they stepped into the crisp night air, Helen's journey of resilience and redemption was no longer just her story. It was a beacon of hope for countless others. If this story touched your heart in any way, share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how it made a difference for you. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to follow the channel for more inspiring stories that truly matter. Your engagement means the world to us as we continue to spread messages like this one. Together, let's turn small actions into big changes.